Hi everyone, I'm Jo from Trekoda Designs, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make the Trekoda Mini Backpack. So this backpack pattern is definitely an intermediate pattern. It's not really suitable for beginners. There are some little tough parts. It's perfectly achievable on a domestic sewing machine because that's what I've used to make all of these. So just make sure that you follow the extra little notes. There's little bits of foam to trim out and things like that if you are using a domestic machine, just to make sure you don't have any trouble. I'd also recommend on a domestic to make these strap connectors out of cotton, regardless of what fabric you're using on the outside. So this one is made entirely of quilting cotton, and as you'll see on the inside there's no binding, there's also no drop-in lining. It's turned and then it's sewn up through the interior pocket so that the lining on the inside of the bag is still nice and neat. So this one made entirely of quilting cotton. As you can see, it's still pretty sturdy. It's got nice shape because of the foam and the Decaville and the Gusset. You can, if you can't get hold of Decaville Light where you live, you can swap that out for foam as well. It's got in the front, it's got this little flap to try and make your pockets just a little bit more secure. You've got a slip pocket here and a zippered pocket here. So there's two options for this zip pocket. You can either have the plain pocket or you can have the cargo pocket. Now if you're sewing on a domestic machine, I strongly recommend doing cork or vinyl in the plain pocket option, because this bulk really adds up, and even my Benina was struggling to get through when I did it on both of these. So if you want to make it easier for yourself, stick with the cotton for a cargo pocket, or go with cork or vinyl on the plain pocket. So that you'll notice another option on this bag is the shape at the top. So this is the rounded top version, and these two both have the boxy top version. So the idea is that if you're making it for your kids, that you can make them slightly different bags. They don't feel like they've got the same bag. But it's also great as a backpack for adults. So just to give you an idea of size, this is a standard 10-inch iPad tablet, and that goes in there nice and easy. And there's loads of room in there for other stuff, absolutely masses of room. So on the inside you've got a little zipper pocket. That's all we've got for pockets on the inside because we've got a few on the outside, but feel free to add some extras if you want them. So if you have any questions, just feel free to leave a comment at the bottom. You won't be able to actually make the bag without buying the pattern, so I'll link my PayHip shop in the video description, and then if you want to buy the pattern and actually sew along with me, then you can do that. So I think that's everything, and we'll get to sewing. One more thing to note, if you're making it for children, then you'll want to make the straps slightly shorter. So if you look at page 2 of the notes in the pattern, it's got an explanation of the different options, the pockets, the tops, and also how much to shorten your straps for kids. Okay, so before I start, I'm just going to go through all the fabrics that I'm using. You'll see on the front page of the pattern that it's got pictures of the bag with arrows showing you each of the pieces and what it's called, so you can pick out your fabrics quite easy. For this particular bag, I'm going to use the same fabric for the whole of the exterior. So on all the pattern pieces and also on the chart on page 4, it shows which pieces need interfacing. So I've used woven interfacing on all of the pieces that need it. Mine's black. That's purely because the supplier was out of white, so I've ended up with black, which is really odd. I'm not even sure why they make it, but it's exactly the same as Shape Flex SF101. It's the same, it's actually called Vilene G700. That's what we use in Europe most commonly. It's also very similar to Woven Fuse. I think Woven Fuse might be a little bit thicker, but it does the same sort of job. So I've fused that already to the back of all my pattern pieces. If you want to see how I block fuse, I've got a little video about interfacing and stabilizers on my YouTube channel, so you can just see how I do it on there. Done the same with my gussets. So I've got all my pieces cut out and interfaced and ready to go for the exterior. Now for my stabilizer, I'm using foam as specified in the pattern. So I've got my foam cut out and ready to go. I'm going to attach all of that later because the front panel needs assembling before we baste that in. So that will come around later. Now for certain parts of the pattern, I also specified to use another stabiliser like Decaville Light. So that's what I'm using for my side gussets and zipper gussets, and also for my flap. So if you don't have Decaville Light, that's fine. You can just use Peltex if you want to. That will give like a more sturdy finish, or you could use foam. I just like the way Decaville gives it a nice sort of firmness to the gusset, but at the same time it's still quite malleable. So that's what I've decided to use, but feel free to replace that. For my straps, I'm going to be using foam offcuts, and I'm just going to zigzag stitch those together, so I'll show you that later. And then for my lining, I've got just a plain cream cotton. Again, I've used black interfacing. Not my preference, but there you go, that's all they had. So, and that seems to be working fine. So we'll make a start, and we'll start with straps. So for my straps, I've got all these offcuts of foam lying around, you know, little bits and pieces. So I've just trimmed them all down to 1/2 inch wide because I'm doing the 3/4 inch straps. If you're doing a 1 inch strap, you want 3/4 inch. So whatever strap size you're doing, just have it 1/4 inch smaller. So what I need to do first of all is like zigzag stitch these together so that we can then use them for the straps. Right, so when you're doing this, you're literally just putting them together, you're butting them up against each other. Don't overlap them, just butt them up. Okay, so you can see there, it doesn't need to be neat, it's just a zigzag stitch to hold these two together. So I'm going to do this with scraps until I've got 2 lengths that are the size specified in the pattern for my straps. Okay, so now my strap foam is stitched together, I'm going to make the actual straps. So if you're using maybe vinyl or something, you probably don't want to use foam, that's fine, you just miss that bit. So because I've got cotton, I really want my straps to be nice and sturdy. Now, I've already followed the steps for the strap. I've folded that over, I've drawn a line down the centre of the whole of the strap on the interfacing side, and then I've folded the edges into that line. Now I'm going to fold that again, and I've pressed it all so that it's 4 layers thick, and it's the same width as the hardware I'm using. So what you now just want to do, once you've done that, is just grab one of your foam pieces and stick that inside one of the folds. So it needs to be 1/2 inch in on each end, that just reduces the bulk later on. So just pop that into the fold. And remember that one end is going to be a raw end and the other end is folded over. So once you've got it in there, it's coming out. Once you've got it in there, you need to then fold this over again and just clip it down the whole length. So once you've done that, you should just have your strap clipped along the whole way, and it'll be nice and spongy on the inside. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch this on all 4 edges. Okay, so there's my 2 finished straps. They've both got one raw end and one finished end. So I'll set those aside. Now I've done the exact same thing with my foam and my grab handle. So you'll notice that both ends are raw, but I've put the foam in the middle and just, sewn that up exactly like I did with the strap. So the next part of the straps, you should have a strap connector that has the interfacing centered. Now the reason I've done this is to make it domestic machine friendly, because if you've got interfacing on these edges, it's going to be really tough later on. It's just going to add to the layers. So that's why I've had you centre that interfacing. Of course, if you've got an industrial machine, you can just go ahead and sew right through it. So I've pressed the long edges in like this. Now I'm going to top stitch both long edges. Right, that's what you should now have. So I'm just going to put a rectangle ring on the end of that and then baste the bottom together. What you'll need next is your strap triangle, which right now is not a triangle, but it will be later, so bear with me on that. So there you go. Now you first of all need to fold this lengthways like that, then you're going to fold it that way and press. And what you've now got is a nice little place for your connector to slot into. So just make sure that your connector is level with the bottom, and that should mean that you've got a nice little gap up here. And you want to have it a little way out as well from this seam. So just check the pattern, it gives you the measurements that you need. So I'm just going to clip that in place and then sew it. So there you go. What I've done is I've just stitched up and across, just with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And now what I'm going to do is turn this into a triangle by joining these two corners and trimming off. So we've got getting rid of these two raw edges. So this is what you should now have. Now what I'm going to do is just mention not to add a rivet at this stage, because it's going to be really close in the seam allowance. If you really want to add a rivet, I'd just wait and do it at the end once the bag's assembled. So I'm just going to do the same thing with my other connector and strap triangle, and then I'm going to have 2 of those completed. Okay, so for your front pocket, I'm actually going to do the plain pocket, but I've decided to show you how to do the cargo pocket, as some of you will want to do that option. So just follow the instructions in the pattern, make sure that you mark the top. As you'll see, I've marked on the outside. That is purely because I've got black interfacing and you guys aren't going to be able to see the lines otherwise. So I've marked it as per the pattern. Now I'm just going to fold it on these outside lines, give it a press, and then stitch them. So you're just going to use a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And now I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Okay, so you should have something a bit like this now. Just remember you've got your T at the top, so you know what's the top. So at the bottom, what you're going to do is bring both of these pleats into the centre line and just clip that into place and baste it. Like that. Now you've also got some measurements for marks at the top, so you just make them, bring the top in, and then I recommend giving that a press with the iron first. It'll just make it slightly easier. Okay, so there it is. Now that's what you should have, and if you give it a good press, it will set those pleats and also get rid of any fabric pens if you have put them on the outside. So that's what you should have. Now you'll notice in the pattern I've made this very slightly bigger than it needs to be, because it requires precise cutting, and I'm just aware that you don't want to make a little bit of a mistake and then have the wrong size pocket. So check the size you've got, and you should need to just trim a little bit off to get it to the perfect size. Okay, so if you're doing a cargo pocket, just repeat the whole process with your lining piece. So you've got one of these in lining and one in exterior. And remember that the top of the cargo pocket is where the pleat is open. So I'm just going to set that aside because I'm using a plain pocket piece. Now you need to put the head on your zip if you're using zipper tape, and I just like to treat the end with a lighter. And what that does is stops it from fraying. If you've got some fray check, you can use that instead. So place your zip right side up, and you want the head on the right hand side. Now take your exterior pocket piece, and you want the top to be lined up with the top of the zip. And just clip that in place. So now we're just going to baste that into place with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. There you go, so that's sewn into place. So you want to place that with the zip, so you can see the zip, but the zip pulled when closed is now going to be on the left. Grab your lining piece. So if you're doing a cargo pocket, this will be the cargo pocket piece. And you're just going to place that right sides together. So there you go. Your lining piece and your exterior are now right sides together with the zip in between. And what you're going to do is sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance if you're using a number 5 zip like me. If you're using a number 3, then you probably want to do a scant 1/4 inch, which is a little bit less than a 1/4. This is what you should now have, and when you pull that over the back, you should have the inside of your zipper pocket. So I'm just going to take this over to the iron, and I'm going to press everything. So I've got a nice neat edge to top stitch. So there you go, that's been pressed, and now I'm just going to top stitch along here through both my exterior and my lining pieces. Now if you're wondering why my lining piece isn't interfaced, that's just because interfacing is quite expensive and I don't like to use it unless I have to, and in pockets I just don't see the need for it. Also, if you're sewing on a domestic machine like me, you're going to notice it with all the extra interfacing in the seams, so I like to reduce it to reduce bulk as well. That's what you should have with your top stitching. So in my pattern I do mention about sewing a couple of stitches over the ends of your zip so you don't lose your head. I don't actually do that myself because I never seem to have a problem with it. So what you're going to need next is this little piece, your slip pocket strip. And with this right side up, you're going to put this right sides together with that open end of the zip. So what you want to do is, if you've got a directional fabric like me, is just check that it's going to end up the right way up. So mine needs to be this way around so that it'll end up with the boats and everything the right way up. And just clip that together. Right, now you're going to sew that with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. What you'll probably notice is that when I'm doing my zips, I baste first and then I sew. You can actually do both at the same time to save you a bit of time, but I like to make sure that my zips are going to be absolutely perfectly straight, and I've found that basting and then sewing the second piece on, that just gives me a nicer finish. So that's why I'm choosing to do it this way. So with that sewn on, there you go, you can see that my boats are the right way up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip that over, and I'm going to get my next piece, which is the cargo pocket or the plain pocket back. So if you're not sure about what your piece is because you haven't used the labels, just go back to page 4 on the pattern. It lists the measurements of every single piece. Make sure that you're using the right piece because some of them are quite similar in size. Now, pop that on the back and clip it to the zip. So there it is clipped. Hopefully you can get an idea of the positioning. So that's the back of my zip head. So now I'm just going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you're using a number 3 zip, you'll want to use a slightly smaller seam allowance. there you go. Now when we push this up on the back, you can open up your zip and you check that you've got a full pocket going on in there. So what I'm now going to do is I'm just going to give this a press on the iron, and then I'm going to top stitch through this. And when I do that, I'm going to make sure all the seams are behind it and that the pocket is pointing down. So this back pocket piece is going to be a little bit long, as you can see. That's just to account again for different zips, because different zips have different widths, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody's covered. So we'll trim that out later, but for now we can just ignore that. Okay, so I've top stitched that, and now I've also just trimmed the bottom off. I just thought I'd get that done now. So I'm going to put that right side up, and I'm going to take my slip pocket back, and I'm going to put that right sides together. So just clip that together, and then we're going to sew the top with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And there you go. Now you just need to flip that back and give it a really good press, and then we're going to top stitch that. So there it is, all top stitched and ready to go. I've also trimmed that down just to make sure all the bottoms match up, because like I said, everything's a little bit too long on the back, because if you're using different zips, I've come across all sorts of zips. Some are 1 inch wide, some are 1.25, some are 1.5, and I just wanted to make sure that you're safe no matter what you're using. So that's all ready to go. Do not baste the sides and the bottom yet. As you'll see in the next step, we need to leave this open for now. Okay, I've just realised that the part where I was making the flap didn't record properly. So rather than starting again, I'm just going to show you how to do the flap using these 2 offcut pieces. So use your paper pattern piece to mark out where the magnetic snaps are going to go. So it's written on the piece, you can't miss it. I'm just going to draw 2 on. So make sure you locate them where the piece states. And then on the lining piece, you're going to use one of the washers, and you're going to put that over that little dot that you've made, and just mark the sides. Like so. And now we're just going to snip those with scissors. And then use some fray check on those slits so that they don't fray later on. Right, you want to grab the male part of your snaps and push that through those slits that you've made. And then you should have some little foam offcuts, so use your washer to mark those as well. And again, cut the slits. So on the back, you want to put the prongs through that foam, and then you're going to put the washer on top and spread those prongs out like that. So what you'll have on your flap is 2 magnetic snaps like that. Then you need to make sure you've got your Decaville fused to the exterior piece. And you're just going to put those right sides together, clip them all the way around, and then we're going to sew around the whole thing with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've done that, I just recommend trimming down the seam allowance around those curves. So I've sewn around the whole thing with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and now what I'm going to do is just trim a little bit off these corners just to make sure I get a neat curve. This way, when I turn it out now, I should be able to get a nice neat finish. So just spend a bit of time poking your corners out, getting them neat, and then press this with an iron because next thing we're going to do is top stitch it. So there's my flap, and that's been pressed with an iron. If you're using cork or vinyl, don't press with heat because it can sometimes damage it. I just would press with my fingers and maybe hold it in place with clips just until I'm top stitching it. So because I've got dark fabric and light fabric, I've changed my bobbin thread to match my lining. I just don't like it when I've got really dark threads on light fabric, but that's personal choice. So now I'm just going to top stitch the whole thing with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. There you go, and I've also just sewn across the top to close that off as well. For this next step, you want to mark the centre on your flap and also on the front top piece. So I've already marked my centres. Now I need to just clip them together. So just make sure that your exteriors are right sides together. So it should look like that, and now we're just going to baste that with 1/8 of an inch. Okay, now that's basted together, you need to get your slip pocket back and have that right side up. You just need to place this on top. So basically you want your flap to be sandwiched between the two pieces. So this is what you should have once it's clipped together. You can see that that's how it's going to look when it's done. I'm going to sew this together with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So there you go. Now you just need to take that over to the iron, press this seam just here, and what you want to do is make sure that all the seams are pointing upward, because when we top stitch it, we're going to top stitch through all the seams. So this is what your front panel should look like, and you can see that I've just top stitched up here. So the next thing that you need to do is grab your front pocket and place it onto this. Now the gap just here at the top of the pocket is going to be a different size depending whether you've used a number 5 zip or a number 3 zip, and just depending on the zipper tape width that you've used as well. So it's not going to make any difference to the pocket in any way. What you need to do is just make sure it's straight on all the edges and clip it into place. Now we want to figure out where to put the magnetic snaps to get the perfect placement. So you've got your snaps underneath here. You just want to press down on them quite hard. And you'll end up with these little indentations. So put your washer over the top of that indentation and just mark the sides. I know this is a slightly different method to normal, but it just ensures that you get the perfect placement. So you can unclip that, take your pocket off, and just get everything else out of the way so that when you're cutting through the front, you're not going to cut through anything else. And again, I'm going to use fray check on these. Same as we did before, we're going to make marks on these foam offcuts as well and cut them. So with each of these female parts of the magnetic snap, you're going to put them through the slits that you made, and then put them through the foam, and then put a washer on. So it'll look like that. Right, once you've got both your magnetic snaps fitted, just make sure that all of the pocket pieces are lying flat and put this back on. So clip those snaps into place. And just get everything lying nice and flat, make sure all your edges are meeting up. And if you haven't already, you can trim the bottom of the pockets off where they're slightly too long. So that should be your completed front. Now we're just going to baste around the edges, and then I'm going to grab my foam and I'm going to clip that onto my foam, and then I'm going to baste all of that together as well. So that should be your finished front panel with the foam. If you're using cotton like me, you might notice that when you're trying to baste it, that the cotton keeps sort of stretching. So I actually find it easier to baste from the foam side, and that stops that from happening. So just check that you're happy with you've got your slip pocket and your zipper pocket. And then set that aside, and we'll start with the back panel. So you should have just your main panel, 2 straps from earlier, a grab handle, and a back strip and a piece of foam for that. So with my back strip, I've already folded the 2 long edges in and given it a press. So now I'm going to unfold that. So you have to imagine which way up it's going to be when it's on the backpack. And what we want to do is attach the straps the right way so that this is going to be facing upwards. So unravel that when it's sat that way. Mark your centre at the top, which I've already done. And then we're going to attach all the handles. The important thing to remember is that if you're making this for an adult, follow the instructions in the pattern. If you're making it for a child, it does tell you to make sure that you move the handles, the straps in closer, because they've got narrower shoulders. So I'm making this for an 8-year-old, so I'm going to place this on the centre mark rather than away from it. If I was making it for a toddler, I think I would even put the straps on the centre mark and put the grab handle on either side, just to make it even narrower. So this panel is facing upwards and the handle is coming towards us. Now grab the strap with the raw end. You should have a raw end on each strap, and just place it right next to that handle. Don't overlap it. Right, do the same thing with this one. There we go. So now I'm just going to baste those into place. And if you just sort of fold that down, you'll see how it's going to look when it's on the backpack, and make sure that you've got your pattern going in the right direction. So now I've sewn that into place, you can see how everything is. So if I was making this for a toddler, I'd probably put the straps there, and then the grab handle ends they'd be on the opposite sides. If you're making it for an adult, the measurements on the pattern are given so that the grab handle is further apart again. So what we're going to do now is just put the foam inside that. And you want the foam to be central, so it's not going to be in the seams on the end. And I'm just going to use a little bit of fabric glue to hold this together so it's not quite so awkward to sew. If you prefer double-sided tape, just go ahead and use some of that. Okay, so mark across the top of your panel. You just take the measurement off the pattern, and you probably can't see my line, maybe you can just see it going through that hut there. There you go, so I've drawn that line on there. And now what we're going to do is place this back strip onto the line. So the top of the back strip is on top of that line that you've drawn. If I can find mine. Right, make sure it's completely central. And just clip that in place. If you prefer, you can use some double-sided tape again to hold this down. Just if it's not the kind of tape that you can sew through, then just make sure that you keep it in the centre bit, because we're going to be sewing around the outside. Okay, so I decided actually to glue mine down, so hopefully that'll stop it from moving. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all the way around all 4 edges. Then I'm going to do another row at the top and the bottom, just to make sure it's really fixed on there. And it also means that we're going through the straps a couple of times, just to make sure that they're nice and fixed. Once I've done that, then I will attach the foam and baste that to the back. But don't baste your foam until after you've done this. Otherwise it just, it can cause the foam to fold because you've got lines of stitching going through it. So it's important to make sure you do that afterwards. So on the back panel, I've basted the foam. Again, I did it from the foam side to stop the cotton from slipping. You probably won't have that problem with other things like cork and vinyl. Now, one thing I did was make sure that the straps were out of the way when I did the top, because otherwise you'll just sew straight through them. And now I'm just going to trim down these little excess bits. So the next step is going to be our zipper gusset, and for this you should have 2 lining gusset pieces, 2 out of your exterior, and then you'll have 2 lining side gussets and 2 exterior side gussets. So I've attached the Decaville to my lining. I just have you do it this way in the pattern because most people are using cork or vinyl or leather for the exterior, and so you can't really fuse Decaville to it easily. So I've already gone ahead and I've done that, nice and central on each piece. What I've also done is I've got my zip. I have actually stitched a couple of stitches on the end because I want to be able to put my zips to the end. If you're using zipper tape like me, make sure that you put the 2 zip heads on, one from each end. That way, when you're using the bag, they'll open away from each other like that. So I'm just going to put them to the end so they're out of the way. First of all, we're going to start with an exterior piece. So I'm going to lay that right side up and put my zip right side down on top. Now you'll notice that the zip is slightly longer. That's because I like to have a bit of overhang so my zip heads are completely out of the way. It just makes it easier to get a nice finish. So mark the centres on both before you clip them together to make sure that they're nice and central. Okay, so I've got my centres marked and I'm going to put my zip right side down with the zip heads on the left. Then I'm just going to clip the whole thing together. So you can see there that my zip is right sides together with my exterior fabric, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to baste that into place with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So that's basted into place. Now keep that with the exterior right side up, and grab one of your lining pieces, and you're going to put it so it's right sides together with the zip wedged in between. So just clip that along the whole length again. So there it is, and you can see that they're right sides together there. Now I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance because that's the seam allowance I use on a number 5 zip. If you've got a different size zip, you can adjust your seam allowance accordingly. So this is what you should end up with, and what you want to do is fold these 2 pieces back, and you'll have your zip heads on the exterior side. So I'm going to take this over to the iron and give it a press around here, press both fabrics away from the zip. That will give me a nice edge to top stitch. If you're using something like cork or vinyl, I recommend giving it a good press with your fingers and then clipping it along the edge to hold it in place. So there's mine top stitched along there. Now your lining and exterior pieces, they should match perfectly. If they don't match, it's either because they've been cut wrong or because you've not pressed the lining as well. So just make sure you press them both because they should match. They're the same size and they have the same seam allowance. So whatever you do, don't sew the sides and don't baste this together. You need to make sure that your lining and exterior are completely separate except for where they're attached to the zip. That's really important because otherwise later we just can't attach the lining panels. So what you're going to do now is place this right side up and grab your other exterior piece, and you want to put it on top of the zip. Now mine again is a directional fabric. I need to make sure that they're both going in the same direction, and they are. So I'm just going to mark my centres and clip these together again. So now that's clipped on, I'm actually going to show you how to do this where you do them both at once rather than basting first, because I know a lot of people prefer that method. So my exterior is clipped on, I'm just going to flip it over, and I'm going to clip my lining in and then sew both of them in at the same time. So there you go, exterior on that side and the lining on that side, and I'm just going to sew through the whole lot with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So there it is, sewn through both. Now you're going to do the same thing as you did before, where you pull the exterior and the lining back, give them both a really good press, and then just top stitch along this side of the zip. And again, make sure you don't stitch the edges or the long open edge. Right, so there's your zip panel. Now this is probably where it's going to get a bit different to what you're used to if you've done a backpack before, because I wanted to be able to berth it rather than doing a drop-in lining. So grab one of your exterior side gussets, and you need to clip it right sides together with the end. Now I'm just going to check my fabrics, yeah, going in the right direction. Now what you need to do is clip it just to the exterior and not the lining. So the lining, it's going to be easier if you just clip that out of the way for now. Okay. Right, so I'm just going to clip this to the exterior. So I'm going to sew it from this side because I need to sew it without sewing over the zip tape. I'm just going to sew across here and then I'm going to skip over and sew across here. Make sure that you're back stitching well on these sections, but do not sew the lining in any way and do not sew the zip tape. So when I was sewing that, I just sewed the two sides and then I skipped over, which means I've got these little threads here I just need to trim. And you'll probably have noticed that I used my hump jumper when I got to the other side, just because this bulk of the deckerville was just making it difficult to get a neat stitch. So what I'm going to do is unclip that. Now you can kind of see how my exterior is joined, but my lining is still separate. So now I'll clip my exterior out the way, and I'll do the exact same thing with the lining. So there's my lining, clipped right sides together, my exterior is out the way, and now I'm going to sew through the lining, but I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance instead this time. And just remember, you're not sewing over the zip tape. And again, you're just going to have those threads where you jumped over, so just trim those off. But as you can see, I've backstitched thoroughly on both sides. Now what you'll see is that my exterior side is attached to the exterior, my lining side is attached to my lining, but they're only connected at the centre. So what we're now going to do is lay everything flat like this, so both your side gussets are lying flat. Clip this all together. I like to clip down the sides as well, just to make sure nothing's shifting. And now I'm going to sew just over the zip tape. So we're going through both side gussets, the whole of the zipper gusset, everything. 3/8 of an inch, just the zip tape. So you can probably see it clearer on the lining side. I'm just going to sew from those stitches to those ones. I'm going to back stitch really well, but I'm going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now what you'll see has happened is this little hole here has now been sealed up, but without us having to stitch on the outside. So for me, I just think it gives a slightly neater finish rather than just having those row of stitches that you have there sometimes. So what I'm going to do is press both these side gussets down, and I'm going to do the whole process again on the other end. And that's your gusset finished. So check page 15 of the pattern. It will tell you what length your gusset needs to be. If you've used any incorrect seam allowances along the way, you might for some reason have a gusset that's the wrong length. If you're making the rounded top, you should have at the beginning cut these shorter, which means your whole gusset will be slightly shorter. So just check the measurements on page 15 of the pattern. Now you should also, because we sewed that extra bit across the tape, you should have no gap here. If you've got a gap, then you've completely missed the step, so just go back and do that. And that should be everything. If you've perhaps used a different sized zipper, then maybe your zipper gusset will be slightly different shape to the end. If that's the case, just trim it to match. But if you're using a standard number 5 zipper, it should all fit perfectly. So now we've come to the exterior assembly, and this is where you need to make sure that you get a really nice finish. So before you go any further, just check that your two exterior panels are perfectly matched. Just in case you've got your cutting wrong or anything like that, it's just really important to have them equal. So both of mine match perfectly, so that's fine. Now you need to fold your gusset and mark the centres on both sides of the lining and the exterior. Mark the centres at the bottom as well on every piece. And then mark your centres at the top and the bottom of both of your exterior panels. So everything's got its centres marked. Okay, so now we're going to attach the gusset. Now, the important bit here that I meant to say earlier is that if you've got a directional fabric, you want to make sure that both of them are pointing upwards. That means that these little houses are pointing downward and these ones are pointing upward. But what you're really going to notice on your bag is actually that these two are both pointing upward. So just make sure that when it's finished, both your bottom bits are going to be pointing upward. You can't avoid the fact that because this is coming over the bag, it's going to be pointing in an opposite direction. But for me, the important thing is that both of these are pointing upwards. So I've done that. Now I'm going to get my lining clipped out of the way because I want to be able to fit my exterior without getting it caught in the lining. So I'm just going to clip it in a couple of places. Yeah, that should do it. So now I'm going to clip my gusset right sides together with my front panel. So we're going to start with the front, and what I'm going to do is match up my centres, if I can find it. Okay, so I'll just put a few clips at the top. Then I'm going to pull the gusset down and clip it into place at the bottoms. So as you can see, my lining is out of the way. I'm only clipping the exterior to this front panel. So now I'm just going to take my time, just clipping the rest into place and easing it around this corner on both sides. Okay, when you get to this bit here, where this seam is, make sure that the seam is pointing downward and just make sure it's nice and tight there, because when you sew through that, that's what's going to hold this in place, because we can't top stitch the gusset there. So making sure that you get a nice tight finish with the seam down, that's going to make a difference later. Okay, so what a lot of people like to do when they get to these edges is just find your scissors. I'm not sure where my scissors are. Okay. A lot of people like to find the scissors and just snip into the corner to make it fit better. Now, it's up to you if you want to do that. Just make sure that your snips are less than the seam allowance, which is going to be 3/8 of an inch. And what you'll probably notice is that I like a really tight gusset, so you shouldn't get any puckering because this is really neatly and tightly fitted. So just use loads of clips to hold it in place and make sure it doesn't move. If you're really worried about it, some people staple within the seam allowance so that then they don't have to remove the clips as they go. So you could try that if you wanted to. got that done. Just make sure that you've not got any of the lining attached. And now I'm going to sew with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance around the whole thing. And what I'm going to do is do a second row of stitching immediately behind the first within the seam allowance after I've done it, because that will just reinforce it. And it means that if the bag's under strain, then the stitches aren't going to stretch and show. So there's my gusset all sewn in. Hopefully you can just about see that I've done 2 lines, so I've done a second line in. So a little tip from one of my testers: if you've got a needle that moves on your machine, then you sew your first line and then you just move your needle to the edge slightly, to one side, and just sew again. And as long as you're keeping the same seam allowance, it will keep a nice neat line next to it. Now what this does is it prevents stretching, so when you turn your bag out and it's under a lot of pressure, you won't be able to see the stitches. Another tip as well is to use a matching thread like I have. I've used a navy thread for this fabric. So if you do get any stitches showing, you won't be able to see it, even if it's just minimal. And one other thing that one of my testers recommended was to even glue or use a little bit of double-sided tape around the gusset instead of staples. That would stop it from moving, particularly if you're using something like cotton that does kind of stretch a little bit. If you don't have a walking foot for your machine and you're finding that it's stretching, then you can just actually glue it into place and it will stop that from happening. So there you go, you're getting an idea now of what it's going to look like. So I'm doing the boxy top, so if you're doing the rounded top, it's going to be a bit more rounded than mine. Now, before we attach the back panel, we're going to attach the strap connectors to the gusset. The reason I do that is because when you open up the seams later on, it's going to mean that it's pushing the straps toward the back, which is great. That's exactly what we want. So what you should have from earlier is 2 of these strap anchors. And what we're going to do is measure on the exterior of the gusset. I'm just going to clip this lining out of the way. So you've got a measurement in the pattern, just follow that. Just mark your gusset up from the bottom. And then what you want to do is grab one of these anchors. And you're going to clip it in place so that the bottom of this lines up with that line you've drawn. So that's how it's going to look. Make sure that this is pointing up toward the zip. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Again, make sure it's pointing toward the zip. If it were like that, that would be wrong because the ring would be closer to the bottom. There you go. Now I'm just going to baste those in place before we attach the back panel. Now another thing that you can do if you're using a domestic machine and you're using cork or vinyl or something, I recommend in the pattern just trimming some of the foam out of the back panel. So there's measurements in there for where you need to do it, and what I do is just rip a couple of basting stitches out and trim out the foam where those connectors are going to be, because once you've got your connectors on, you've got quite a few layers, which is fine for me with this cotton, but when I was doing it with vinyl, cork before on previous backpacks, it was really tough to get through there. So I would recommend, if you're using a domestic machine, just trim out the foam where those connectors are going to be. Okay, so I've cut the foam out just so you can see what I mean about sewing with a domestic machine. So I've removed a couple of basting stitches and then I just trimmed this out. And that just means that when we're sewing over the strap connectors and everything, there's going to be a lot less bulk. I'm still going to use a pretty big needle, probably a size 100, something like that, to get through all that bulk. But if you do this, be really careful not to cut through the fabric. I will just warn you of that. One more thing, I've sewn those strap connectors in before I attached the gusset to the back. But one other thing that one of my testers mentioned is that because of the way it's constructed, if you wanted to, you could top stitch this front panel before you go any further. So you could just top stitch around the whole of the gusset side. If you just wanted a really neat finish to your backpack, you don't need to, but if you enjoy top stitching, then yeah, you can definitely do that. So grab your back panel, make sure that your lining is again clipped out of the way. And what I'm going to do is just try and make sure my straps don't get in the way. Match up the centre marks again at the top. Right, put a few clips on there. We're going to sew again from the gusset side because it's easier, in my opinion. And then you're going to clip the bottom. Make sure that your strap anchor is inside. So I realised then that my centre mark was slightly off and that was throwing out my corners, so one of the corners wasn't fitting right. So I've corrected that, and there you go, there's my back fitted. So you might be able to see now where the foam's trimmed out, that corresponds to where these strap anchors are, and so that means that this bulk is a lot less. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew it from the gusset side again. I'm going to do 2 stitches again, same as I did before. You're going to have to move it around a little bit more because this side is going to get in the way. So just don't be afraid to just, you know, crush it up, bunch it up, move out of the way, just to make it easier for yourself as you're sewing around this gusset. So now you've sewn your exterior gusset on, you should have a really good idea of what your bag's going to look like, and if you want to, you can just turn it out and check your seams, that's up to you, but make sure you undo the zip, just going to make it a bit easier later. And then I'm going to tuck my straps in. So I've already attached the foam to my base. Same as usual, when I was basting it, I make sure that the fabric is on the feed dogs and the foam is on top, because that way it doesn't stretch. Whereas if I have the fabric on top, it tends to stretch. So what we need to do is attach this. So mark your centres on every side, and you've already marked your centres on all your panels. So what you're going to do now is match it up to one of the long panels. So I'm going to start with my front panel. And it should match up perfectly to those side seams. So that's what you got. And then what you're going to do is you're going to sew along here with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So you're actually going to be sewing from that cutout corner just there, all the way across to this cutout corner here. And just like I did with the outside, I'm going to do a double seam just to make sure that if the seam's under pressure, the stitches aren't going to stretch. So I'll do that first, and then straight afterwards, I will pull this out and I'll match up this side of the base to the back, and I'll sew that exactly the same way. So that's the two long sides of the base done, sewn into place, and I've got my second seam behind there as well. So before we can fit these short sides of the base, we have to make little snips into the gusset so that it fits. So at the moment you won't be able to get these two to connect. So what I'm going to do is just here on the gusset side of the seam, and just here, I'm going to snip in by 3/8 of an inch. So I'm just snipping in by the same as the seam allowance. Hopefully you can see that. Right next to the stitches. And what that now means is that I can attach those two together, clip them together, and then I can sew that. So I'm going to sew this again with the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to do it from the base side because for me I find that easier. The only thing to note, if you're using something like cork or vinyl that's quite thick, then it's going to be a bit bulky here. You might want to use either a hump jumper as you start off here, or you could use a zipper foot, because then your foot's going to be here and it's not going to get caught on this bulk. So you could probably tell there that when I got to where the front panel is, because of all the bulk from the pocket, I used my hump jumper to make sure that I got a nice neat finish. So you're just making sure, not sure if you can see that, but you're sewing from the cutout to the next cutout so that your stitching on the base is basically just one giant rectangle. So there you have it. I've done both sides of the base, and you can probably see better now that it's basically just one big rectangle. So this is my preferred method for the base. Some of you are going to absolutely hate this and prefer when a bag has a whole gusset. If you want to do it that way, it's so simple really. You just need to cut out your base without these notches cut out, sew your base onto your gusset before you attach the whole gusset to the bag, and that will work just fine. This is just my preferred method. Whichever way you do it, I recommend trimming out the foam from the base, because for me it gives a really nice finish. There's just too much bulk otherwise when you turn it out. So what I do is I just remove the basting stitches and then I trim the foam out. And it can seem a bit faffy, but once you've done it a few times, it won't take you any time at all. And you'll get really good at using a seam ripper. So I just simply take out the basting stitches and then I just trim it up to my stitches. Just be careful not to actually cut through your stitches though. So that's what it looks like with the foam trimmed out of the seam allowances. So that's just my personal preference. It takes maybe, you know, 5 or 10 minutes extra, but for me it's totally worth it. So now we're moving on to the lining. First things first, do not forget to trim your lining panels. That's the very first step in this lining section. So I've already done that. I've trimmed the bottom off each of mine. Otherwise they won't fit because your gusset, you use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so they need to be a little bit smaller. So one of my lining panels, I've already drawn a little line in a fabric pen that I can erase later. And that's in preparation for my pocket. So just use the measurements in the pan. Now, a few people have asked me about doing the zip pocket facing. So the easiest way to draw this box on, for this pattern anyway, is simply to measure. So you're just going to measure 1 inch in, draw a line, and literally do that on every side. And what you'll be left with, probably can't see it very well on my black interfacing, is basically a rectangle that's the exact size that you need. So that's the easiest way to do it. Then what you're going to do is put this right sides together with your lining panel. Now if you fold your panel in half, you can find the centre quite easily. Do the same with your zip facing. And then when you put it right sides together, you can just match up those folds so that you know it's central. And I'm going to line it up with that measurement from earlier. So I'm just going to pin that into place, ready for sewing. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew that box, that rectangle, and then that'll be ready to create the pocket. Now, before we go over to the sewing machine, I'm just going to prepare the next piece. So for your pocket, you should have 2 pocket pieces. One's interfaced, one's not. I'll start with the one that's not interfaced. It's not really important, but I'm just going to put that right side up, and I'm going to put my zip right side up with the head on the right. So clip that into place. And while I'm at the sewing machine, I'm going to sew that with just under 1/4 inch, maybe about 1/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to sew the rectangle on the zip facing at the same time. So that's your sewn rectangle, and now you're going to have to cut out the centre line and the 2 triangles at the end, which you cannot see on this interfacing, but the diagram is inside the pattern. So I find if I just fold it, it gives me a good place to start. Now when you're cutting the triangles at the end, you need to get as close to the stitching in the corner as you possibly can, but do not clip your stitching. Once you cut that out, you need to put that through to the back. Okay, so you can start to see what we're going to have there. And what I'll do is spend a bit of time just rolling the seams out between my fingers, and then I'm going to press it on the iron to make sure I get a nice neat finish on both sides. But before I do that, I've got my zip pocket, so I've sewn that on. Now what I'm going to do is take my other piece. This is right side up, and I'm just going to put the zip on top of that. So my zip head is going to be on my left, and I'm just going to clip that in place and sew it again with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So what you've got now is the right side of your zip is on the wrong side of the fabrics, and this is the right side of the fabric with the wrong side of the zip. So just take that over to the iron and give that a good press whilst you're also pressing out your zip facing. Okay, so that's nice and pressed now. You're just going to have to ignore my wet patches from my iron. So grab your pocket, make sure it's open like this with the zip head on the left, and what we're going to do is place that over the top and sew around it. But to make sure that it stays in place, I'm going to use some fabric glue. You can use double-sided tape if you prefer. And just try to keep it behind the stitches so it's not going to leak out. Okay, so now you're going to make sure that your zip head is inside the hole. And you just want to place that on top. Right, so now the glue's dried, I'm going to stitch all the way around the outside with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. A lot of people prefer to use a zipper foot, but I just move the needle on mine, and I love to use my standard foot, so just use whatever works for you. So I've sewn around that box, and now what I've done is I've folded the top pocket piece down, and you can see that this one is longer. So I'm just going to trim this one so that they both match. Then I'm going to fold them each up by 1/2 inch and press. I think I just said 1/2 inch, but I actually meant 1/4 inch. So I folded each of those up by 1/4 inch and pressed. That's because later on we're going to seal up the lining through this, so we just want to make this nice and neat later. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to sew both sides just from top to bottom. I'm not going to sew the bottom at all. I'm going to back stitch really well down here. Okay, so now we're on to final assembly. So you're almost there. It'll feel like it's taking ages to make this bag, and then all of a sudden you're at the end because there's no top stitching. So grab your bag, find the back panel. So you want the zipper, the gusset, the lining gusset that's on the back. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it right sides together with the pocket. So this is the right side of my lining, right side of my panel, and I'm just going to match up those centre marks. Okay, now you're going to attach the bottom to the bottom of that lining gusset and do that on both sides. Right, what you're going to want to do is kind of jam the exterior into itself. Don't be afraid to just wrestle the bag around a bit. And just make sure that you're still attaching it all to the same side of the gusset. So this is what you should end up with. Don't be afraid to use a lot of clips, and you'll probably find with your lining that you definitely need to snip in to the corners to make them fit nice and neatly. So I've done that, and now what I'm going to do is just sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So remember, you're using a bigger seam allowance for the lining because we want the lining to be smaller. So 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. Okay, so you probably noticed in that video that as I'm going around, it can get a little bit awkward. So you can shove your hand inside and just push the exterior out of the way. It makes it way easier to then sew the seam, because the exterior has the habit of just kind of falling down in the way. So what I'd say now is just to trim your seams, and where the curves are, just snip into them so that they sit neatly on the inside of the bag. So the next step is to attach the other lining panel, and you might notice that you can't actually get to the other bit right now, so you're going to have to turn this out a little bit. There you go. And then what you want to do is you want to attach your panel to this gusset piece. So I'm just going to kind of cram that inside a bit so it's out of the way. You're going to have to press your bag afterwards anyway, because we're birthing it, so don't be afraid to get it a bit creased at the moment. Right, so match up your centre mark again, match up your bottoms, join it all the way around, and then we're just going to do the exact same thing, sew it with a 3/8 of half an inch seam allowance. Okay, so what I've done is I've sewn that second panel into place. I've trimmed the seam allowance again, and I've put little snips into my curves to make sure that it bends nicely when we turn it out. So the next bit is to put the base on, and we're just going to do the exact same thing that we did with the exterior, but what we're going to remember to do is leave a 6-inch turning gap in one of the long edges. So I'm going to sew the front on first, then I'm going to sew on the back, but on the back I'm only going to sew the edges. I'm going to mark and make sure that I only sew up to the marks to make sure that my gap is 6 inches. Now make sure you back stitch really well on this bit, because you're going to birth the bag through there and you don't want it to split. So once you've sewn one long side and left a gap in the other, now we need to do the same thing that we did with the exterior and just snip into the gusset there, just by half an inch to meet the seam, and then you're going to sew that together and do the same with the other side. So there you go. Just trim down these 3 sides of the lining, but do not trim this one because you're going to have to sew that up in a minute. And then we're just going to turn it out through this tiny little gap. spend some time poking your corners out and everything like that. Now, if you're thinking that that looks really tough, that's because I made my gap just 5 inches wide instead of 6 inches, because I just wanted to demonstrate that it can be done. And even if you're using cork, I've made plenty of these in cork, and most of my testers used vinyl, you can definitely turn it through a 6-inch gap. So the reason we're not turning through the pocket is because the zip itself is only 5 inches, so for some materials that's going to be really tough. But I just wanted to demonstrate that it can be done and that 6 inches is plenty of space. So once you've spent a bit of time sort of poking your corners out and making sure that you're happy with everything, then you need to open your zip inside. And what you're going to do is you're going to pull the lining through. Okay, so we're going to clip this together and then we're going to sew the lining shut so that you won't be able to see it from the inside of the lining. So remember to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance so it matches the rest of the lining. Okay, now you can trim that side of the lining just to get rid of some of the bulk. Just get rid of that seam allowance a little bit. Okay, and tuck that back inside. So it's a bit messy, I'm definitely going to need to press this, but you're going to now have a sealed lining all the way around. So the last thing to do is to pull your pocket out and just clip that together. So the reason we folded these edges earlier was because now it's going to give us a really neat finish when we're stitching it. So these stitches will be on show, but they're inside a pocket, so no one will ever notice. And now you're just going to stitch that across with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, or as small as you can get really. So shove that pocket back inside there. And now I'm just going to spend a good amount of time just getting rid of any little loose stitches, pushing out the seam allowance, just making sure that it's really neat. And then I'm going to press it with the iron before we fit the strap connectors, the strap sliders, which is the very last step. Okay, so hopefully at this point you are loving your bag. This is the very last step. So we're just going to attach the strap sliders. Grab one of your straps and just make sure that you've got it straight. So you're going to put the end through this middle bar, like that. And then just pull it through. Okay, now you're going to go from the outside of the bag toward the inside, like this. And you need it to go back over the middle bar. So what we're doing is going up through there, back down. Now, if you're using something like cork or vinyl, make sure you're using a nice wide strap connector because they come in different widths. Okay, so this is where we're going to sew. We're just going to sew like a box around here to hold this in place. Now, before you sew it, just pull the strap straight, make sure that that's working. So if you just put a clip on there and just check that your strap works, then you know you can be confident when you're sewing through it that you've definitely put that on right. So I'm just going to do the same with this other one, and then I'm going to sew them both into place. Okay, so that's it. So I do recommend using a zipper foot when you're sewing the straps on. It's a little bit awkward. I actually ended up just doing, not sure I can get you to see it, just 2 lines there. So one right by the slider and one at the end. And I'm going to put a rivet through there just to finish it off. So there you go, that's your finished backpack. I really hope you like it and that you enjoyed making it. The pattern's available, if you haven't already got it, from my PayHip shop, and I will put a link in the description of the video. If you've got any questions, just feel free to leave a comment, and you can check out my other patterns. I've got video tutorials for most of them. Just check out my YouTube channel.